When Chief Justice Carmen Ellis, a black judge, rules against powerful developers in a housing discrimination case, she becomes the target of a racist smear campaign orchestrated by corrupt officials and a prejudiced officer determined to ruin her career. Facing baseless accusations, public humiliation, and systemic corruption, Carmen uncovers a shocking conspiracy to exploit marginalized communities while enduring overt racism and microaggressions designed to undermine her authority. This infuriating story exposes the insidious ways power is abused and racism thrives in America's institutions, forcing Carmen to fight not only for justice, but also for her reputation and dignity. The sun dipped low over the city skyline, casting long shadows that crept across the bustling streets. Among the crowds moving through the city's heartbeat was Lara Perez, her duffel bag slung over one shoulder, the faint scent of chlorine still clinging to her from her evening swim. Her stride was purposeful, her eyes scanning the street ahead. A lifetime of caution honed from years as an EMT who had seen the worst humanity could offer. It wasn't just her job that made her wary. It was the quiet nights like these, when the air felt too still, when the streetlights flickered like a warning. Her grip on the strap of her bag tightened as she moved past a group of men loitering near a convenience store. Their laughter was loud, their eyes sharp as they tracked her movements. "Hey, sweetheart," one of them called, his voice carrying over the din of passing traffic. Lara didn't flinch, didn't falter. She'd been here before, more times than she cared to count. Her focus stayed fixed on the crosswalk ahead, each step measured and steady. "Come on, don't be rude," another voice chimed in, slick with mockery. "We're just trying to be friendly." Her jaw tightened. The air seemed to thicken, the noise of the city fading into the background as their voices grew louder. Behind her, she could hear the scrape of shoes on concrete, the casual swagger of someone closing the gap. Lara's breath remained even, her pace unbroken, but her mind was already calculating, 4 of them mid-20s, maybe older. One wore a hoodie pulled low over his face. Another cracked his knuckles like he'd been waiting all night for a fight. Their laughter grated on her nerves, a sharp contrast to the silence she maintained. "Hey!" The leader's voice rang out, sharper now, demanding attention. "You deaf or something? We're talking to you." Lara's hand slid into the pocket of her bag, brushing against the compact flashlight she always carried. Not a weapon, but a tool. A way to blind, disorient, and buy time if it came to that. Her thumb hovered over the switch, her pulse steady. "I said, stop!" The footsteps quickened behind her, the tone shifting from amusement to something darker. She stopped. Her body remained still, her head turning slightly to glance over her shoulder. Her eyes met theirs, and in that moment, the playful arrogance on their faces faltered. Her gaze was sharp, steady. A gaze that had met death on too many nights to be shaken by the likes of them. "Walk away," she said, her voice low but firm, carrying an edge that made the leader hesitate for just a second. A second too short. The bell above the cafe door jingled softly as Carmen Ellis stepped inside, the familiar hum of clinking dishes and quiet conversations washing over her like a balm. She loved this place, Cooper's Cafe, a modest, family-run diner nestled in the heart of Richmond, Virginia. It wasn't the kind of spot you'd expect to find one of the most powerful women in the country, but that was precisely why Carmen favored it. At 41, Carmen was the kind of woman who turned heads without trying her skin. A deep, warm ebony caught the afternoon light streaming through the cafe's windows, and her tailored navy pantsuit hinted at a lifestyle far removed from the unassuming booths and checkered floors of Cooper's. But despite her title, Chief Justice of the Virginia Supreme Court, Carmen carried herself with an understated elegance that belied her immense power. No entourage, no chauffeur idling at the curb. Just her, a tote bag slung over one shoulder, and an air of quiet determination. "Afternoon, Miss Carmen," called Earl, the cafe's longtime manager, from behind the counter. He tipped his faded Red Sox cap in her direction as he flipped a burger on the flat-top grill. "The usual?" "Afternoon, Earl." "Yes, please," Carmen replied, flashing him a warm smile. Her voice was rich and steady, the kind that could fill a courtroom, yet felt perfectly at home in this small-town diner. She slid into a booth near the window, setting her bag beside her. Outside, the world bustled on, traffic inching through the city, pedestrians hurrying along the sidewalks. But inside Cooper's, time seemed to slow. Carmen pulled out her tablet, scanning through a draft opinion she'd been working on for weeks. It was a pivotal case, one that would set a precedent for housing discrimination laws statewide. She was all too aware of the weight her words carried, especially as the first black woman to hold her position. But the job wasn't about glory or recognition. It was about making things right, brick by brick. "Here you go, 1 BLT and an iced tea," Earl said, setting the plate and glass in front of her. "You're working too hard again. Every time you're in here, you've got your nose buried in that thing." "Guilty as charged," Carmen said with a chuckle, setting the tablet aside. "But it's important work." "Always is with you," Earl said with a knowing nod before retreating to the counter. Carmen picked up her sandwich, savoring the simplicity of the meal. She appreciated the grounding normalcy of places like Cooper's, especially when her days were often filled with high-stakes decisions and relentless scrutiny. Here, she was just Carmen, a woman who liked her BLTs crisp and her iced tea with a lemon wedge. Across the diner, a group of men had gathered at a table by the door. They were dressed casually, jeans, work boots, and flannel shirts, laughing loudly as they sipped their coffee. Carmen noticed them in her periphery but didn't pay them much mind until one of them, a tall man with a thick southern drawl, raised his voice. "Crazy how some people get handed everything, huh?" he said, his words heavy with implication. "Think they can just waltz in here like they own the place." Carmen's brow furrowed slightly, but she kept her focus on her meal she'd learned long ago to pick her battles. Still, her ears pricked as the man continued, his tone dripping with mockery. "Bet she's one of those types. You know. Got lucky with some fancy scholarship, or a diversity hire deal, probably wouldn't know hard work if it slapped her in the face." The laughter that followed grated against Carmen's composure. She set her sandwich down, her appetite suddenly waning. The man's words weren't directed at her, not explicitly, but the pointed glances and exaggerated laughter told her all she needed to know. "Hey Mike," one of the men at the table said, lowering his voice. "Maybe you shouldn't—" "What I'm just saying," Mike interrupted, his voice rising again. "Some folks act like they're better than everyone else, coming into places like this, looking down on the rest of us." Carmen exhaled slowly, her grip tightening on the edge of the table. She wasn't here to make a scene, but she also wasn't one to shrink in the face of disrespect. Her mind raced through possible responses, calm, measured, and undeniably clear. Before she could act, Earl approached the group, wiping his hands on his apron. "Mike," he said, his tone firm, but not unkind. "You're scaring off my customers. Maybe tone it down a notch?" Mike waved him off, muttering something about freedom of speech. As Earl retreated, Carmen caught Earl's apologetic glance in her direction, and she offered him a small, reassuring nod. She could handle this. As she finished her tea, Carmen decided she wouldn't leave without addressing the issue, but she'd wait for the right moment. She wasn't one to let prejudice go unchecked, especially not in a place she considered a sanctuary. But she also understood the importance of timing, of choosing when and how to speak, so her words carried the weight they deserved. Outside, the sun began to dip lower, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. Carmen gathered her things, sliding her tablet into her bag and leaving a generous tip on the table. As she approached the counter to pay, Earl greeted her with a sheepish smile. "Sorry about them," he said quietly. "Mike's got a big mouth, but he's harmless." Carmen met his gaze, her expression calm but firm. "Harmless words can do a lot of damage, Earl, especially when no one speaks up." Earl nodded, his face clouded with thought. "You're right, guess I should have handled it better." Carmen placed a hand on his arm, her voice softening. "It's not easy, but silence only lets it fester." As she stepped outside, the cool evening air greeted her, brushing against her skin like a whispered reminder of the challenges she carried. The men from inside were loitering near the entrance, their laughter fading as they noticed her approach. Mike leaned against the wall, his arms crossed. "Leaving already?" he said, his smirk wide and unapologetic. "Guess you got more important places to be." Carmen paused, her posture relaxed, but her gaze unwavering. "I do," she said evenly, her voice carrying the weight of quiet authority. "But before I go, let me share something with you." Mike straightened slightly, his smirk faltering as Carmen stepped closer. The streetlights cast a warm glow over her face, highlighting the quiet determination in her eyes. "Hard work isn't something you can measure by the dirt on your boots or the sweat on your brow," she said, her tone calm but piercing. "It's in the choices you make, the character you show when no one's watching, and let me be clear, your words today say far more about you than they do about me." The group fell silent, their bravado deflating under Carmen's steady gaze. She let the silence linger for a moment, before stepping past them, her heels clicking softly against the pavement. As she walked to her car, Carmen felt the tension in her chest ease slightly. This was just another day, another encounter in a lifetime of facing down prejudice and ignorance. But it was also a reminder of why she did what she did, why she used her position, her voice, to fight for a world where people like Mike couldn't hide behind their words. Sliding into the driver's seat, Carmen started the engine and glanced at her reflection in the rearview mirror. Her face was calm, her resolve unshaken. The road ahead was long, but she was ready for the journey. Carmen turned onto Main Street, the comforting hum of her car engine doing little to soothe the weight pressing on her chest. The encounter outside Cooper's Cafe lingered in her mind, like a sour taste, her calm mask barely holding back the simmering frustration beneath. It wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last. But that didn't make it easier. She was due at the courthouse in an hour for a community event, an informal discussion with local leaders about judicial reform and its impact on marginalized communities. These events were Carmen's passion. They allowed her to connect directly with the people her decisions affected, to hear their stories and use their insights to guide her rulings. Yet, even here, bias sometimes crept in, an insidious thread in the fabric of her work. The courthouse was a stately building, its marble facade glowing softly in the fading light. Carmen parked in her reserved spot at the back and walked toward the entrance, her heels clicking against the concrete. As she reached the steps, a security guard stepped into her path, his hand raised in a halting gesture. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his tone brusque. "Visitors need to use the side entrance." Carmen paused, her expression neutral. "I'm not a visitor, I work here." The guard's eyes swept over her, lingering on her simple navy blazer and tote bag, his brows furrowed, as if trying to reconcile her words with the picture in front of him. "You work here?" he repeated, skepticism thick in his voice. "In what capacity?" Carmen's jaw tightened, but she kept her tone even. "I'm Chief Justice Carmen Ellis." The guard blinked, his posture stiffening. "Oh," he said after a beat, the word dragging with reluctant realization. "Sorry about that, just doing my job." She offered him a curt nod, stepping past him toward the grand double doors. Her chest felt tight, her composed exterior masking the churn of emotions beneath. How many times had she walked through these doors, her title emblazoned on plaques and programs, only to be treated like she didn't belong? Inside, the courthouse lobby buzzed with activity. Civic leaders and community members mingled, their voices blending into a low hum. Carmen spotted Judge Paulson, one of her colleagues, speaking with a group of local activists. He caught her eye and waved her over, his smile wide and disarming. "Carmen," he said warmly, "glad you could make it. Let me introduce you." As she approached, Carmen could feel the subtle shift in the group's energy. Some faces lit with recognition, while others turned guarded, their eyes narrowing as they assessed her. She extended her hand to a woman in a sharp green blazer. "Good evening," Carmen said, her voice steady. "Carmen Ellis." The woman hesitated a moment before shaking her hand. "Angela Robbins," she replied, her tone polite but clipped. "President of the Richmond Civic Alliance." Angela's grip was firm, her eyes scanning Carmen with a mix of curiosity and doubt. "I'll admit," Angela added, "I wasn't expecting, well, someone like you in your position." Carmen raised an eyebrow, her smile tight. "Someone like me?" Angela's cheeks flushed faintly. "I mean, it's just, your reputation precedes you, of course. I've read your rulings on housing discrimination cases, very thorough." "Thank you," Carmen replied, though the compliment felt backhanded. "I take pride in my work." Paulson, sensing the tension, clapped his hands together. "Why don't we all grab a seat, the panel's starting soon." The panel was held in one of the courthouse's larger conference rooms, a spacious area with polished wood paneling and rows of chairs arranged in neat lines. Carmen took her place at the front, alongside Paulson, Angela, and a few other speakers. The room filled quickly, the audience a mix of activists, city officials, and concerned citizens. As the moderator introduced the panelists, Carmen scanned the crowd, noting the range of expressions: admiration, skepticism, indifference. It wasn't new. Every room she entered, every audience she addressed, carried the same unspoken questions. Did she earn her position? Was she qualified? Did she deserve to be here? The moderator turned to her with a warm smile. "Chief Justice Ellis, you've been a trailblazer in your role. Could you start by sharing your perspective on how the judicial system can better serve marginalized communities?" Carmen leaned into the microphone, her posture confident. "Of course," she began, her voice resonating through the room. "The judicial system's purpose is to ensure justice for all, but we have to acknowledge that systemic biases have long undermined that mission. Reform isn't just about policy changes. It's about changing the way we think, the way we treat people, and the way we hold ourselves accountable." As she spoke, she noticed a man near the back shift in his seat, his expression skeptical. He leaned toward his neighbor, whispering something that made the other man smirk. Carmen kept her focus on the audience, but the microaggression registered. The discussion unfolded with a mix of agreement and debate. Angela was vocal, often pushing back on Carmen's points with a sharpness that bordered on hostility. "You speak about systemic change," Angela said at one point, her tone cutting. "But isn't it true that most of your rulings still favor established legal frameworks? How can you claim to represent marginalized communities when you operate within a system that oppresses them?" Carmen met Angela's gaze evenly. "Change doesn't happen overnight, Ms. Robbins. And while the legal framework has its flaws, my job is to navigate within it while pushing its boundaries. Every ruling sets a precedent, and every precedent is a step forward." Angela opened her mouth to respond, but the moderator stepped in, redirecting the discussion. Carmen exhaled silently, her calm mask intact, but the exchange had taken its toll. She wasn't just debating policy, she was defending her existence in a space that often felt determined to exclude her. As the panel concluded and the audience began to disperse, Carmen lingered near the front, answering questions from a few attendees. Most were thoughtful, some challenging, but one man's question lingered like a thorn. "Don't you think you're asking for too much?" he had said, his tone laced with condescension. "The system's not perfect, but it works. Isn't it better to focus on what's achievable instead of stirring the pot?" Carmen had responded with practiced poise. "If we settle for what's achievable, we ignore what's necessary. Progress requires discomfort." By the time Carmen left the courthouse, the sky had turned a deep indigo, stars faintly visible above the city lights. Her steps were steady, but her thoughts swirled with frustration. Tonight had been a microcosm of her daily reality, a constant battle to prove herself, to push for change in a world that resisted it at every turn. She reached her car, her hand lingering on the door handle as she glanced back at the courthouse. Its stately facade seemed almost mocking, a reminder of the institution she fought to reform from within. With a sigh, she slid into the driver's seat and started the engine, the low rumble breaking the silence of the night. As she drove home, Carmen allowed herself a moment of vulnerability, her composure slipping as she gripped the steering wheel tighter. Anger simmered beneath her calm surface, not just at the biases she faced, but at the system that allowed them to persist. But even in the face of that anger, Carmen's resolve remained unbroken. This was her fight. It had always been her fight, and she wasn't about to back down. The following morning dawned cold and gray, the kind of weather that mirrored Carmen's mood. She sat at her kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee, as the news droned softly in the background. Reports of local crime rates, political disputes, and economic disparities filled the airwaves, the anchors' voices blending into white noise. Her mind lingered on the panel discussion from the previous evening, and Angela Robbins' biting questions. Even in spaces meant to foster change, progress felt like dragging a boulder uphill. Her phone buzzed on the counter, pulling her from her thoughts. She glanced at the screen. A text from Mitchell, a junior clerk at the courthouse. "Mitchell, Judge Paulson's looking for you." Something about the East Point case says it's urgent. Carmen frowned. The East Point case, a class action lawsuit against a property management company accused of discriminating against black tenants, had been simmering for months. She had ruled in favor of the plaintiffs just weeks earlier, a decision that sent shockwaves through the local legal community. It wasn't the kind of case that faded quietly into the background. She typed a quick response and grabbed her coat. Whatever it was, Paulson's urgency meant it wasn't good. When Carmen arrived at the courthouse, the atmosphere was tense. Conversations hushed as she walked past, heads turning just enough to follow her movements without seeming obvious. It wasn't unusual for Carmen to attract attention. Her presence always carried weight, but this felt different. Charged. Paulson was waiting in his chambers, his expression unusually grim. He waved her in, shutting the door firmly behind her. "Carmen," he began, his tone heavy. "There's something you need to see." He gestured toward his desk, where a stack of papers sat alongside an open laptop. Carmen leaned over, scanning the screen. It was an email thread between the city's housing authority and a private legal consultant. The subject line read, "East Point Enforcement Review, Urgent." She skimmed the contents, her stomach twisting as she read the lines aloud. "Recommend halting enforcement until judicial review of Ellis ruling political pressure mounting, potential optics issues." She looked up sharply. "What is this?" Paulson sighed, running a hand over his thinning hair. "It's worse than it looks. The housing authority is under pressure from the city council to delay implementing your ruling. They're claiming they need to evaluate potential conflicts, but we both know what that means." "They're stalling," Carmen said, her voice low and steady, "because they don't like the ruling and think they can wait me out." "Exactly." Paulson sat heavily in his chair. "And now, some council members are questioning whether you should have recused yourself from the case." Carmen blinked, the words sinking in like a lead weight. "Recused? On what grounds?" Paulson hesitated, then pushed another document across the desk. "They're claiming bias, that your background makes you incapable of impartiality in cases involving race or discrimination." For a moment, Carmen couldn't speak. The sheer audacity of the accusation struck her like a blow. She had dedicated her entire career to upholding the law with integrity, often at great personal cost. To have that integrity questioned, because of her identity, no less, was both infuriating and devastating. "This is a smear campaign," she said finally, her voice tight with controlled anger. "They don't care about impartiality, they care about protecting their own interests." Paulson nodded grimly. "I don't disagree, but the optics are bad, Carmen. The media's picked up on it. You need to prepare for what's coming." By midday, the courthouse was buzzing with rumors. Reporters loitered outside, their cameras trained on the building's entrance. Carmen's face had already begun circulating on social media, accompanied by inflammatory headlines. "Activist judge oversteps in housing case," and "Impartiality of Chief Justice Ellis called into question." As she made her way to her chambers, Carmen noticed Officer Daniels, a senior courthouse security guard, leaning against the wall near the elevator. His arms were crossed, his expression unreadable. He'd always been curt with her, his clipped tone carrying an undertone of disdain that never quite veered into outright disrespect. "Big day, huh?" he said as she approached, his voice laced with a thin veneer of politeness. Carmen didn't break stride. "Every day is a big day, Officer Daniels." "Sure," he said, falling into step beside her. "But this one feels different, lots of eyes on you." She stopped and turned to face him, her gaze steady. "That's nothing new." Daniels smirked, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Well, let's hope everything checks out. Wouldn't want people thinking there's fire where there's smoke." The words hung in the air, their implication sharp. Carmen's jaw tightened, but she didn't take the bait. "I appreciate your concern," she said coolly, stepping into the elevator and letting the doors close on his smirk. Back in her chambers, Carmen found Mitchell waiting with a stack of case files. His nervous energy was palpable, his fingers tapping in erratic rhythm on the edge of the desk. "I saw the headlines," he blurted as she entered. "This is insane, they can't actually believe—" "They don't," Carmen interrupted, setting her bag down. "But belief isn't the point. This is about undermining me. If they can plant enough doubt, they win. Mitchell's brow furrowed. So what do we do? Carmen took a deep breath, her mind racing. We fight. We gather evidence, document every step of the ruling, and counter their narrative with facts. But first, a sharp knock interrupted her, and the door swung open before she could respond. Officer Daniels stepped inside, flanked by 2 city investigators. Their presence filled the room, heavy with authority and implied threat. Chief Justice Ellis, one of the investigators said, his tone formal. We need you to come with us. Carmen's pulse quickened. On what grounds? We've received a formal complaint regarding your conduct in the East Point case, the investigator replied. We need to ask you some questions. Mitchell stood abruptly. You can't just... It's fine, Carmen said, raising a hand to calm him. She turned to the investigators, her expression unreadable. Let's go. The questioning room was stark and cold, its fluorescent lights casting a harsh glow over the gray walls. Carmen sat across from the investigators, her posture composed but tense. Daniels lingered near the door, his presence a reminder that this wasn't just a procedural matter. It was personal. For over an hour, they probed her decision-making process in the East Point case, their questions laced with insinuations. Had she allowed personal bias to influence her ruling? Had she consulted with advocacy groups before issuing her decision? Was she aware of the economic impact her ruling would have? Carmen answered each question calmly, methodically dismantling their arguments. But beneath her composed exterior, anger simmered. This wasn't about justice or accountability, it was an attack, a calculated attempt to discredit her and intimidate others like her. Do you have anything else? She asked finally, her tone sharp. The lead investigator hesitated, then closed his notebook. Not at this time. Daniel smirked as she stood, his eyes following her like a predator sizing up prey. Hope this doesn't get too messy, he said as she passed. Carmen stopped in the doorway, turning to face him. You should hope the same, she replied evenly, her gaze cutting through his facade. That evening, Carmen sat alone in her office, the weight of the day pressing down on her. The investigators' questions echoed in her mind, each one a reminder of how easily the system could turn against her. But even in the face of that injustice, she refused to bend. Her phone buzzed on the desk, a text from Mitchell lighting up the screen. You're trending. Ellis under fire. Carmen sighed, swiping to open the news app. The headlines were relentless, the commentary brutal. But among the noise, a single comment caught her eye. They only come for you when you're making a difference. The words resonated, cutting through the doubt and exhaustion. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for everyone who had been silenced, dismissed, or underestimated. And she wasn't done yet. As the clock struck midnight, Carmen's phone buzzed again, this time with an anonymous message. They're not just targeting you. Check the housing authority's budget reports, follow the money. Her breath caught as she stared at the screen, the pieces beginning to align. This wasn't just about discrediting her ruling, it was about hiding something much bigger. She stood, a renewed determination hardening her resolve. If they thought she would back down, they didn't know. Carmen Ellis. Carmen's hands hovered over her laptop keyboard, the anonymous message glowing faintly on her phone beside her. They're not just targeting you. Check the housing authority's budget reports, follow the money. The words burned into her mind like a challenge. She couldn't ignore them. If there was corruption at the heart of this, it would explain the lengths they were going to discredit her ruling. She leaned forward, her fingers dancing across the keyboard as she searched public records and scanned financial disclosures. Minutes turned into hours as she pieced together a web of transactions, payments routed through shell companies, suspiciously low property valuations, and unexplained allocations in the housing authority's budget. The patterns were there, faint but undeniable. Someone was profiting from the discrimination her ruling had sought to dismantle. Got you, she muttered under her breath. A knock on her office door made her jump. The sound was sharp in the quiet of the courthouse late at night. Carmen hesitated, her heart pounding, then rose to open the door. Mitchell stood there, his face pale and drawn. I couldn't sleep, he admitted, clutching a folder to his chest. This whole thing has been eating at me, I figured you'd still be here. You were right, Carmen said, stepping aside to let him in. They're hiding something. Mitchell's eyes widened. What did you find? Corruption, Carmen said, her voice steady but grim. Someone's funneling money through the housing authority. It's big enough that they're trying to bury me to protect it. Mitchell sat heavily in the chair across from her desk, his expression a mix of shock and anger. So what do we do? Take it to the press. Carmen shook her head. Not yet. We need more. If we go public too soon, they'll just spin it as a desperate attempt to deflect from the accusations against me. Mitchell nodded slowly. I might know someone who can help a journalist, Natalie Lane. She's been covering housing issues for years. If anyone can dig deeper, it's her. Set up a meeting, Carmen said, determination hardening her resolve. But we keep this quiet. The last thing we need is for them to catch wind of what we're doing. The next morning, the courthouse was alive with activity, reporters swarming the steps like vultures. Carmen slipped in through a side entrance, avoiding their questions and cameras. The air inside was heavy with tension, and she could feel the eyes of her colleagues on her as she made her way to her chambers. Officer Daniels was waiting by her door, his arms crossed and a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. Busy morning, Chief Justice, he said, his tone mocking. Press is having a field day. Carmen didn't break stride. Some of us have work to do. Daniel's smirk faltered as she unlocked her door and stepped inside, shutting it firmly behind her. She leaned against the door for a moment, exhaling slowly. They wanted her rattled, distracted, but she wouldn't give them the satisfaction. Later that afternoon, Carmen and Mitchell met Natalie Lane in a quiet corner of a downtown cafe. Natalie was sharp-eyed and no-nonsense, her notebook and recorder at the ready. You're saying the housing authority is laundering money? Natalie asked, her voice low but urgent. And that it's tied to your ruling? Carmen nodded. It's more than a theory. The evidence is there, but it's buried deep. We need someone with your resources to connect the dots. Natalie scribbled furiously in her notebook. If this is as big as it sounds, it could blow the entire operation wide open, but it's risky, they'll come after all of us. They're already coming after me, Carmen said. This ruling, it was never just about housing, it's about power, and they won't stop unless we make them. Natalie met Carmen's gaze, her expression resolute. I'll dig, but you need to be ready. If this goes public, it's going to get ugly. I've been ready my whole life, Carmen replied. The days that followed were a blur of tension and preparation. Natalie fed Carmen and Mitchell updates as she uncovered more connections, politicians receiving kickbacks, developers exploiting loopholes, and a clear link to the housing authority's top brass. The corruption ran deep, implicating people at every level of the system. As Carmen reviewed the findings late one night, her phone buzzed with a text from Natalie. They know. Before Carmen could respond, her office phone rang. The number was blocked. She hesitated, then answered. Chief Justice Ellis, a deep voice said, smooth and menacing. You've been busy. Carmen's grip tightened on the phone. Who is this? Someone who appreciates discretion, the voice replied. You should too walk away, and this can all go away. Keep pushing and, well, you've seen how messy things can get. Carmen's pulse quickened, but her voice remained steady. Is that a threat? Consider it advice, the voice said, before the line went dead. She stared at the phone in her hand, the weight of the moment settling over her. They were desperate, which meant she was close, but desperation made them dangerous. The next day, as Carmen arrived at the courthouse, a black SUV idled at the curb. Two men in suits stepped out as she approached the steps. Chief Justice Ellis, one of them said, flashing a badge. We're with the State Ethics Board. We have questions about your involvement in the East Point case. Carmen squared her shoulders. I've already answered your questions. We have new information, the man said, his tone clipped. You'll need to come with us. A crowd of reporters swarmed as they led her to the SUV, their cameras flashing and voices shouting. Carmen kept her head high, her composure unshaken despite the humiliation. She could feel the weight of their stares, the judgment in their eyes, but she refused to let them see her falter. As the SUV pulled away, Carmen met the gaze of one of the investigators. This isn't about ethics, she said. It's about silencing me. The man didn't respond, but the flicker of unease in his expression told her she was right. Hours later, Carmen sat in a stark interrogation room, her mind racing. They were trying to break her, to make her second-guess herself, but she wouldn't give them the satisfaction. As she prepared for their next round of questions, her phone buzzed in her bag, the vibration faint but insistent. Natalie's message flashed on the screen. "I have proof they're linked to the mayor's office. This changes everything." Carmen's heart pounded as the door opened, and an investigator stepped inside. "Let's talk about your finances, Chief Justice." She leaned back in her chair, a quiet determination settling over her. They thought they had her cornered, but they underestimated her resolve. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. Carmen sat in the dimly lit interrogation room, her back straight and her hands clasped on the cold metal table. The investigator across from her, a tall man with a hawkish face and a carefully rehearsed neutrality, flipped through his notes with a deliberate slowness. She could feel the weight of his gaze when he finally looked up, as if he was searching for cracks in her armor. "Chief Justice Ellis," he began, his tone flat. "You've had quite the week, haven't you?" Carmen met his gaze evenly. "I've had worse." He smirked faintly, tapping his pen against the edge of his notebook. "You understand the severity of these allegations, don't you? Financial improprieties tied to your ruling on the East Point case, that's not something the ethics board takes lightly." "Allegations," Carmen said, her voice steady. "Based on nothing more than conjecture and bad faith. If you have evidence, show it. Otherwise, this is nothing but an intimidation tactic." The investigator leaned back in his chair, his smirk fading. Before he could respond, the door opened, and Officer Daniels stepped inside. He moved with the casual arrogance of a man who thought the room belonged to him. Carmen's stomach tightened as their eyes met. This wasn't protocol. Daniels had no reason to be here. "Officer Daniels," she said coolly, "to what do I owe the pleasure?" Daniels closed the door behind him, leaning against it with his arms crossed. "Just thought I'd observe. Can't have you pulling any tricks now, can we?" Carmen's jaw clenched, but she refused to rise to the bait. Daniels was a bully, but bullies thrived on reactions. She would give him none. The investigator cleared his throat, clearly unsettled by Daniels's intrusion, but unwilling to challenge it. "Let's get back on track. Your financial disclosures show multiple charitable donations to housing advocacy groups, some of which are now tied to the plaintiffs in the East Point case. Can you explain that?" Carmen's lips twitched in a faint smile. "Yes, I can. Those donations are public record, made years before this case was filed. Are you suggesting judges should abstain from charitable giving altogether, or is this standard only being applied to me?" The investigator hesitated, his pen hovering above the page. Daniels cut in, his tone dripping with condescension. "Oh, come on, Ellis, you think anyone's buying that you're squeaky clean? People like you always find ways to game the system." There it was, the unspoken accusation laid bare, the implication that her success was undeserved, that her integrity was a facade. Carmen's anger simmered, but she kept her voice calm. "People like me?" she repeated, her words slicing through the air like a blade. "Do clarify, Officer Daniels. What exactly do you mean by that?" Daniels' smirk widened, his confidence emboldened by the silence in the room. "You know exactly what I mean." The tension was thick as Carmen leaned forward, her gaze locked on Daniels. "Let me tell you what I mean. Then I've worked twice as hard, for twice as long, to get half the respect you take for granted, and I've done it with integrity. Something you clearly know nothing about." Daniels' smirk faltered for a split second before returning, but the room's atmosphere shifted. The investigator, sensing the charged energy, cleared his throat again. "Let's keep this civil." "Civil?" Carmen said, her tone sharpening. "What's civil about this? You're dragging me through baseless accusations while the real corruption goes unchecked, and Daniels here," she gestured sharply at him, "is a perfect example of the rot you're trying to distract from." Daniels straightened, his smirk replaced by a glare. "Watch yourself, Ellis." "No, you watch yourself," Carmen shot back, her voice rising. "You've been circling me like a vulture since I stepped into this courthouse. Is it my rulings that bother you, Daniels? Or is it just the fact that I don't fit into your idea of who belongs here?" Before Daniels could respond, the door swung open, and Mitchell burst in, his face flushed. He clutched a folder in one hand and a phone in the other. "Carmen," he said, his voice breathless but determined. "You need to see this." The investigator frowned. This is a closed session. It won't be for long, Mitchell interrupted, shoving the folder onto the table. Natalie just sent this over. It's all connected: the housing authority, the developers, even the mayor's office. Carmen's eyes widened as she flipped through the documents. Bank statements, email threads, and contracts painted a damning picture of systemic corruption. Mitchell's phone buzzed, and he held it up, showing a live feed from Natalie's social media account. The journalist's voice was clear and unwavering as she outlined the conspiracy in real time. This isn't just about housing discrimination, Natalie said. This is about power, greed, and a system designed to keep marginalized communities underfoot. Daniels moved toward Mitchell, his hand outstretched. Give me that phone. Mitchell stepped back, holding it out of reach. No way this is going public. Daniels' face darkened, and he turned to Carmen. This doesn't clear you. You're still under investigation. Carmen rose to her feet, her posture commanding. No, Daniels. What this does is expose the real reason for this so-called investigation. It's a cover-up, plain and simple. The investigator looked at the documents, his face pale. We'll need to verify this. Do that, Carmen said firmly. And while you're at it, maybe you should investigate why Daniels is so invested in discrediting me. Daniels scoffed, but there was a flicker of unease in his eyes. You're not walking out of here like some hero, Ellis. I don't need to be a hero, she replied, her voice steady. I just need to do what's right. As the tension reached a breaking point, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. Moments later, 2 uniformed officers entered the room, followed by a senior official from the ethics board. He held up a hand, his expression stern. Everyone, stand down, he said. We've received word of a major investigation into the Housing Authority. Chief Justice Ellis, you're free to go. Daniel's face twisted in frustration. You can't be serious. The official cut him off with a sharp look. Serious enough to have your conduct reviewed, Officer Daniels, effective immediately. Carmen gathered her things, her movements calm but purposeful. As she passed Daniels, she met his glare with unwavering resolve. This isn't over for you, she said quietly. But for me, it's just the beginning. Outside the courthouse, the press swarmed, shouting questions and snapping photos. Carmen stepped into the spotlight, her head held high. The documents were in Mitchell's hands. Natalie's exposé was spreading like wildfire, and the first cracks in the system had begun to show. But as she looked out over the sea of cameras, Carmen knew the fight wasn't over. The system she was up against was vast and deeply entrenched. Her victory here was just one battle in a much larger war. She took a deep breath, ready to face whatever came next. The hallway outside the ethics board's office buzzed with tension. Carmen stood, her hands clasped behind her back, her gaze fixed on the frosted glass door in front of her. Inside, a group of investigators, including Daniels, were huddled in what had to be a last-ditch effort to regain control of their crumbling narrative. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, but she refused to let it show. Mitchell stood to her right, clutching the folder of evidence they'd collected. His usually jittery demeanor was steady now, bolstered by the gravity of what they were about to do. To her left, Natalie Lane held her recorder at the ready, her sharp eyes darting between the door and Carmen. You sure about this? Natalie asked quietly. Carmen's jaw tightened. Positive. When the door opened, Daniels was the first to step out. His expression was a mix of forced confidence and barely contained fury. He gestured sharply for Carmen to enter. They're ready for you. Good, Carmen said, brushing past him. Without hesitation, Mitchell and Natalie followed closely, their presence a silent show of solidarity. Inside, the room was cold and impersonal. A long table stretched across the center, flanked by stiff-backed chairs. At one end sat the lead investigator, his face pale and drawn. Daniels took a seat beside him, his jaw clenched so tightly that a vein pulsed at his temple. Carmen remained standing. She placed both hands on the back of the chair in front of her, leaning forward slightly as she addressed the room. Before we begin, I want it on record that this meeting is being recorded. She nodded toward Natalie, who held up her recorder for emphasis. The investigator shifted uncomfortably, but nodded. Understood. Daniels sneered. This isn't a courtroom, Ellis. You don't make the rules here. No, Carmen replied, her tone cutting. But I'm not here to play by yours either. The tension in the room was palpable as the meeting began. Daniels wasted no time launching into his accusations, rehashing claims of financial impropriety and bias. His words were sharp, but Carmen could see the cracks in his facade, the sweat gathering at his hairline, the way his hand tightened into a fist on the table. Carmen let him speak, her expression calm but unyielding. When he finally paused, she straightened and fixed him with a steely gaze. Are you finished? Daniels leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. For now. Good, she said, sliding the folder of evidence onto the table. Because it's my turn. She opened the folder, pulling out a series of documents. These are financial records from the Housing Authority, showing suspicious payments to shell companies tied to the mayor's office. These funds were funneled through back channels to developers who have systematically displaced marginalized communities. The investigator's eyes widened as he scanned the documents. Daniels's smirk faltered. Carmen continued, her voice gaining momentum. These emails, she held up another page, show direct communication between Officer Daniels and one of these developers discussing strategies to discredit me and derail the East Point case. Daniels, care to explain? Daniels slammed a hand on the table, his face twisting with anger. You don't know what you're talking about. Oh, I think I do, Carmen shot back, her voice sharp. You've been working to protect a corrupt system because you benefit from it. This isn't about justice, it's about power, and you're terrified of losing it. The room fell silent. The lead investigator cleared his throat, his hands trembling slightly as he shuffled the papers in front of him. This is significant. We'll need to verify. You'll have your verification, Natalie interrupted, holding up her phone. I've got sources backing this up. By the time this meeting ends, the story will be live. Daniels turned on Natalie, his face red with fury. You're all in over your heads. You think this changes anything? You're just stirring up trouble. Carmen stepped closer, her voice low but unwavering. The only trouble here is the one you created, Daniels. You've spent your career exploiting a broken system, but today it ends. Daniels stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. For a moment, it seemed like he might lunge at Carmen, but he held himself back, his chest heaving with barely restrained rage. You think you've won? He spat. This system will eat you alive. Carmen didn't flinch. Maybe, but at least I won't let it define me. The lead investigator rose, his expression conflicted. Officer Daniels, you'll need to step outside while we review this evidence. Daniels glared at him, then at Carmen, before storming out of the room. The door slammed behind him, and the room fell into an uneasy silence. As the investigators pored over the documents, Carmen sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap. Mitchell leaned toward her, his voice a whisper. Do you think it's enough? It has to be, she replied, her eyes fixed on the lead investigator. But even if it's not, we've taken the first step. The minutes dragged on, each one heavy with anticipation. Finally, the lead investigator set the documents down and looked up at Carmen. This is damning evidence, he admitted. We'll need to launch a formal investigation into the Housing Authority and Officer Daniels. Carmen nodded. Do what you need to do, but understand this. If you don't act swiftly and transparently, I will take this to the public myself. The investigator hesitated, then nodded. Understood. Outside the building, the air was crisp and cold, but Carmen felt a weight lift as she stepped into the open. The crowd of reporters was still there, their cameras flashing as they called out questions. Carmen raised a hand for silence, then stepped forward to address them. This morning, new evidence has come to light exposing corruption within the Housing Authority and its connections to the East Point case. I have provided this evidence to the Ethics Board, and I expect them to act decisively. Justice is not a privilege, it's a right, and I will continue to fight for it, no matter the cost. Her words were met with a flurry of questions, but Carmen didn't stay to answer them. She turned and walked away, her steps steady, her resolve unshaken. As Carmen reached her car, her phone buzzed with a message from Natalie. I'm getting pushback from higher-ups. They're trying to bury the story. We need to move fast. Carmen stared at the message, her mind racing. The fight wasn't over, not yet. If the system wanted a war, she was ready to give them one. The exposé went live the following morning, dominating headlines across every major media outlet. Natalie's investigative piece, meticulously backed by the evidence Carmen and Mitchell had uncovered, laid bare the web of corruption stretching from the housing authority to powerful developers and even the mayor's office. The fallout was immediate. Carmen watched the coverage unfold from her office, the soft hum of the courthouse outside, a sharp contrast to the chaos erupting on the news. Her name was everywhere. Not as the accused, but as the courageous figure who had stood firm against a corrupt system. Still, she knew the fight wasn't over. Mitchell entered, his face alight with a mixture of relief and awe. "Natalie's report is trending nationwide," he said, dropping a fresh newspaper onto her desk. The headline read, "Corruption Exposed: How One Woman Stood Up Against the System." Carmen skimmed the article, her chest tightening with a mix of pride and exhaustion. "It's a start," she said, her voice measured. "But there's still so much to do." Mitchell hesitated, then nodded. "You think Daniels will face charges?" "He has to," Carmen said firmly. "There's no way he can slither out of this." Her prediction proved correct. By the end of the week, Officer Daniels had been placed on administrative leave pending an investigation. The mounting evidence against him, including leaked emails detailing his involvement in the conspiracy, made his removal inevitable. When the mayor's office announced its own internal investigation, public outrage reached a fever pitch. For Carmen, the victories were bittersweet. While Daniels and others were being held accountable, she knew the system they had exploited was far from dismantled. Her ruling on the East Point case, now upheld by the courts, would pave the way for greater protections against housing discrimination. But it was just one piece of a larger puzzle. The courthouse buzzed with activity as Carmen prepared for a press conference. She stood before the podium, the weight of the moment pressing down on her, but failing to crack her composure. Reporters crowded the room, their cameras trained on her. "I took an oath to serve justice," she began, her voice steady but resolute. "That oath is not conditional. It does not waver in the face of threats or intimidation. What we've exposed here is more than just corruption. It's a system that thrives on the silencing of those who dare to challenge it. But let me be clear. Silence is no longer an option." She paused, letting her words settle before continuing. "This fight is not mine alone, it belongs to every person who has ever been marginalized, overlooked, or dismissed. Together, we will ensure that justice is not just an ideal, but a reality." The room erupted in applause, but Carmen didn't linger to bask in it. She stepped down from the podium, her thoughts already turning to the work ahead. Later that evening, Carmen returned to her apartment. The quiet was a stark contrast to the chaos of the past weeks, but it was a welcome reprieve. She sank onto her couch, her body aching with exhaustion, but her mind buzzing with resolve. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was a text from Natalie. "Developers already pulling out of shady deals. This is bigger than we thought. Thank you for trusting me with this." Carmen allowed herself a small smile as she replied, "Thank you for amplifying the truth." The next morning, Carmen received an unexpected visit from Judge Paulson. He stood in her office doorway, a sheepish expression on his face. "I owe you an apology," he said, stepping inside. "When all this started, I didn't stand by you the way I should have. I let my own fears get in the way." Carmen regarded him for a moment, then nodded. "Fear is a powerful thing," she said. "But so is accountability. The fact that you're here now means something." Paulson exhaled, relief softening his features. "You've done more than expose corruption, Carmen. You've reminded us all why we're here in the first place." As the days turned into weeks, the ripple effects of Carmen's actions began to take shape. The Ethics Board implemented stricter oversight policies, and several housing projects tied to the corruption scandal were frozen pending review. Community leaders, inspired by Carmen's courage, organized town halls to address systemic inequities. Carmen attended one such meeting in the heart of the East Point district. The room was packed. The Energy Electric residents shared their stories, their struggles, and their hopes for a fairer system. As Carmen listened, she felt a deep sense of purpose reignite within her. When the floor opened for questions, a young woman stood, her voice trembling but determined. "What can we do to make sure this never happens again?" Carmen stood, her gaze sweeping the room. "It starts with vigilance," she said, "with holding those in power accountable and refusing to be silent when you see injustice. Change isn't easy, and it isn't quick, but together, we can build something better." The applause that followed wasn't just for her, it was for the collective resolve of a community refusing to be broken. As Carmen left the meeting, Mitchell fell into step beside her. "You know, you've become something of a legend," he said with a grin. Carmen shook her head, a faint smile playing at her lips. "Legends don't work this hard." They walked in companionable silence for a moment before Mitchell spoke again. "So what's next?" Carmen's gaze lifted to the horizon, the city lights stretching out before her. "Next, we take this momentum and turn it into action." "This isn't the end, Mitchell. It's just the beginning." In the quiet of her apartment that night, Carmen reflected on the journey that had brought her here. The challenges she had faced, the resilience she had discovered within herself, and the hope she had seen spark in others. The system was far from perfect, but she was no longer fighting it alone. As she sat down at her desk to prepare for the next case, Carmen felt a deep sense of clarity. She wasn't just a judge, she was a force for change, and she wasn't going anywhere. Carmen stood on the courthouse steps, her breath visible in the crisp morning air. The sun cast a warm golden hue over the city, a stark contrast to the storm she had weathered in recent weeks. This place, once a symbol of systemic inertia and corruption, now felt like a battlefield she had crossed and survived. But as she looked out at the city beyond, she knew her journey was far from over. The fight against Daniels, and the corruption tied to the housing authority, had been grueling, pushing Carmen to the brink of exhaustion. Yet as she reflected on everything, she realized that her most significant battle hadn't been against an individual, or even a system. It had been against the creeping doubts that whispered she should stay quiet, endure, and survive rather than resist. By confronting that internal struggle, she had emerged not just as a victor, but as someone deeply changed. Carmen's resilience was not newfound, it had always been part of her. But this experience had honed it into something sharper, something more purposeful. She had learned to trust in her own strength, even when others doubted her. The injustice she had faced had been a crucible, and while it left scars, it also solidified her determination to continue her work. "I've spent too much time thinking about surviving," she murmured to herself as the city buzzed around her. "Now it's time to thrive." Personal growth and new resolve. Carmen's growth wasn't just about standing her ground, it was about finding the courage to transform adversity into action. Before this ordeal, she had been a justice bound by tradition, seeking to make change from within a rigid system. Now, she understood that the system didn't just need reform, it needed voices like hers to challenge its very foundation. Her experience with Daniels had exposed how deeply entrenched biases could corrupt even the most seemingly impartial institutions. It wasn't enough to win her case or secure her rulings. The fight had to extend beyond the courtroom, reaching into the halls of power, into legislation, and into the minds of those who still believed the status quo served justice. Carmen had seen firsthand the power of collective action, Mitchell's unrelenting support, Natalie's fearless reporting, and the voices of the East Point residents had been integral to her victory. This was a fight no one could win alone, and moving forward, she intended to amplify those voices alongside her own. Broader implications. The fight against injustice. The events surrounding the East Point case had been a microcosm of a much larger issue. The corruption that allowed developers to exploit marginalized communities wasn't an anomaly. It was the symptom of a system designed to protect the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. Carmen's fight had drawn national attention, sparking conversations about racism, economic inequality, and abuse of power. For every Daniels, there were countless others who operated in the shadows, perpetuating injustice while hiding behind layers of bureaucracy and plausible deniability. Carmen's case had shown the importance of shining a light into those shadows, of refusing to let wrongdoing go unchecked. It wasn't just about punishing the guilty, it was about dismantling the systems that enabled them in the first place. Her ruling in the East Point case had created a precedent that would reverberate for years, making it harder for landlords and developers to engage in discriminatory practices. But Carmen knew that laws alone weren't enough. Change required vigilance, education, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. Carmen's story became a beacon of hope for others. Her courage inspired other judges to examine their own rulings with greater scrutiny, activists to demand systemic accountability, and ordinary citizens to recognize the power of their voices. Social media lit up with messages of solidarity, the hashtag #EllisStrong, trending as people shared their own stories of standing up to injustice. One message in particular stayed with Carmen. It came from a young girl named Layla, who wrote, "I want to be like you when I grow up. I want to fight for what's right and never back down. Thank you for showing me how." Layla's words brought tears to Carmen's eyes. They reminded her that her fight wasn't just about the present, it was about the future. Every step she took, every battle she fought, was laying the groundwork for the generations to come. It wasn't just about winning, it was about creating a world where others wouldn't have to fight so hard to be seen, heard, and valued. A call to action. Carmen stood in her chambers that evening, gazing out at the city lights. The weight of the past weeks settled on her shoulders, but so did a quiet sense of fulfillment. Her work wasn't done. There were still cases to rule on, reforms to advocate for, and battles to fight. But she was no longer fighting in isolation. She turned to her desk, where a stack of letters from East Point residents awaited her attention. Each one was a reminder of the lives her work had touched, the people who now had a chance to rebuild and thrive. Their words were filled with gratitude, hope, and determination. They had faced their own trials, but they hadn't given up. Neither would she. Carmen picked up her pen, scrawling a note in the margin of her latest case brief. Justice is not a destination, it's a journey. A closing reflection. The events that had unfolded were a testament to the power of persistence and the necessity of courage. Carmen had faced prejudice, corruption, and an unrelenting system designed to break her. Yet, she had not only survived, she had triumphed, and in doing so, she had shown others that change was possible. As she closed her brief and prepared to leave for the night, Carmen allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. Her fight had been long and grueling, and there were moments when the weight of it had felt unbearable. But through it all, she had learned one invaluable truth. Change begins with a single voice refusing to be silenced. And when that voice is joined by others, it becomes a force no system can withstand. With that thought, Carmen stepped out of her chambers, the cool night air greeting her like an old friend. The road ahead was long, but she was ready for it. And this time, she wasn't walking it alone.